The good news, that is old news, the Spirit continually renews as the greatest news, we find in John 20. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his sides. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace to you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive this Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We have seen the Lord." So he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." And after 8 days his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, and the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And truly, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. COVID-19 has changed so many things for many, many people. For those who have gotten it, it's destroyed, I understand, many people's lungs, and they don't know if those lungs will ever fully recover. For many people, they've lost their jobs, or their businesses have to close, and even when this pandemic is over, some of those businesses won't come back. Some of those jobs will still be gone. And of course, there are those who have died. I think it's around 40,000 so far that they know of in the United States. The lives of the family and friends of those who have died, their lives will ever be different because of COVID-19. They've lost that one that they love. For many of those people, they surely wish that they could go back and have things be as if this disease had never been. They could go back and have a job. They could go back and have their loved one. They could go back and breathe normally. But the thing is, we so rarely get to go back and have things as if that bad thing never happened, do we? We can't go back and make it so that it's like our sin never was. We can't go back and make it so that when we lose a dear one, it's as if he had never died. But the thing about Jesus' resurrection is that Jesus' resurrection makes so many things like they never had been. Look at him. Standing in our text before the disciples as if he still loved them. As if they had not all just abandoned him. As if they still had a job. As if Jesus still wanted them as his disciples. As if he had forgiven them their sins. How could Jesus be standing there in those midst as if all those things were true? As if they hadn't done those things. As if they hadn't left him. As if they were his disciples. As if they were forgiven. How could he be? Because all those things were true. It wasn't just as if their sins were forgiven. He was standing there because their sins were forgiven. He wasn't just standing there as if he still wanted them as his disciples. He was standing there because he did want them as his disciples. COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. For many people, at least, some people's life have pretty much stayed the same, but for so many, Jesus' death turned the world upside down for the disciples. Here, everything they thought and believed, and most of their beliefs, and many of them at least, were false, were wrong, were destroyed. They just spent all these years of their life. They had just given up their careers for the purpose of being Jesus' disciples. They said they would follow him to the ends of the earth. They would give their lives for him. They thought this is what they would be doing. And then suddenly the rug gets yanked out from under them. Jesus dies. Not only now are they faced with the sadness of losing this one they love, but now they're faced with the despair and the depression that comes from, what are we going to do now? They just spent years studying to be Jesus' disciples, and now he's gone. They just spent years thinking, falsely, that they were pretty great people, that they would make good disciples. And now suddenly the blinders are lifted from their eyes, all of them fleeing that night, abandoning their Lord. Suddenly, especially to Peter, becomes clear, I am not a good disciple. I'm not an asset to God. I'm a liability. But Jesus appears to them as if they're not. As if they're not liabilities. As if they're not sinners. Why? Because their sin was gone. You know, Jesus was standing there as if he had never died, except for a couple of big things. What was different about Jesus? It was still him. It was his voice that they recognized. It was his face. He was truly alive. But what was different? The marks in his hands, in his side, and his feet. To show them and us that things truly had changed. He had been dead. And now is alive. And those marks showed the disciples and showed us. And those marks showed us that God's justice for the disciples' sin, for our sin, had been poured out on Christ. That's why the disciples could have Jesus standing in their midst as if they weren't terrible sinners, as if he wanted them, because he did, and because they were forgiven. You know, Luke records how the disciples at first, when Jesus appeared, they couldn't believe it was him for joy. Can you blame them? After what the disciples did, after, for example, the things we've done to God in our lives, should we expect that God would appear among us with a message of peace? After what the disciples saw happen to Jesus, him beaten and hung up a tree and pierced with the spear and dead, would they expect to see him alive and happy to see them? That just seems too good to be true. And that's why at first they would not believe. How could you be standing there as if we didn't do those things to you, Jesus? And when Jesus comes on the last day and says to you, come, inherit the kingdom I prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Part of us might be surprised. How can you say that to us, Jesus? As if we deserve that. As if we don't have all these sins. He can say that to us as if we have none of those sins because we don't have those sins. Those marks of Jesus show us that. They show us that sin was put upon Jesus and he died for it. Yes, if you were training someone for some work and you spent years training them, and after years of training, they were still more liabilities than assets, what do? Oh, you fire them. You give them a pink slip. But is that how Jesus appeared in their midst? Saying, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. You're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. Or maybe even with something a little milder, maybe just a... That's not how he appeared. What one word describes with what type of attitude, what message he came to them with. Peace. Even after what they had done, even though they were failures as disciples, failures as God's children, failures as sons of Abraham, even though we are failures as God's disciples, just as bad as these 11 disciples, even though our sin is great, even though we are failures, that same word encompasses how Jesus appears in our heart with the gospel. Not going, but peace. And those wounds there, they're to show us that. The same was true for Thomas. Now, how do we refer to Thomas? We call him Doubting Thomas. You know, we, in this world, we are sometimes called names. You've probably been called some pretty bad ones, perhaps while you were an adolescent, as a teenager or older. Maybe some of those names that you were called still bother you. Probably not doubting, or worst part, Martha, or denying Peter, but probably been called some things. Some of those things you have been called and I've been called, they are probably partially true, or maybe fully true. Some of them are perhaps not true at all, because this world is evil. People call names. But how is it that Thomas is known to Jesus? Jesus does not think of Thomas as Doubting Thomas. He thinks of him as Thomas. In this world, we might bear shame and contempt, and people might call us names and think of us a certain way our whole life because of the sins we've done. Like Martha, like Peter, like Thomas. But Jesus arose on Easter, and he appeared to Thomas, not calling him Doubting Thomas. He doesn't think of Thomas that way, and he doesn't think of us as a doubter. He doesn't think of us as a betrayer. He doesn't call us those names. Because of those marks, it is, as the proverb says, a fine name, a good name is much more to be desired than many riches. Because it is terrible to live among men when they have contempt for you. And perhaps men's and others' contempt of us and the foolish things we've done or the wrong things we've done, maybe we're deserving of it. Certainly we're deserving of God having many monikers for us, calling us a doubter, a denier, a failure, a fool, a sinner. And yet he is alive and he comes to us with none of those names. He does not call you any of those. How? How could that be? Why could that be? How can it be that he does not call us those things as if those sins of ours never were? Because of those marks. And so the disciples, they still had a job. They still had a purpose. God still wanted them. And so he said, forgive the sins of any. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained, which was their job as disciples and your job as disciples. To share the gospel of peace and the law of condemnation. And for those who know of Jesus' resurrection and are repentant of their sins, to reassure them, your sin is forgiven. I'm not forgiving it. I'm just letting you know Jesus has forgiven it. We have that purpose too. We have that privilege. We have that joy, that great news. Jesus came to me and to you as if our sin is gone, with a message of peace, because by what he did, our sin is gone. We may have to live with shame, the shame of what we've done. Perhaps Peter was called Denying Peter behind his back his whole life. Perhaps Thomas was called Doubting Thomas his whole life. We may have to live with shame and contempt of men because of sin we committed. We certainly have to live with the curse of sin. Adam and Eve's sin. COVID-19 is one example. But we don't have to live our whole life here on this earth facing contempt from God. He has no contempt for you. Because he's taken you, Jesus has taken you to himself, taken your sin, and he died for it. Nor do we have to live our whole life with the shadow of death hanging over us. Because on the last day, it will be as if we had never died. Even though these bodies, they will fail and die, on the last day, it will be as if we never died, with a few exceptions. Remember how Jesus was alive, but with a few exceptions? Well, he had those marks still on him. We too will have a few exceptions on the last day when Jesus raises us up. Our body will no longer be mortal and corruptible. We will put on incorruption and immortality. We will no longer have a sinful nature. And then it will be as if all the pains and problems that we experience in this life, it will be as if they had never been. Why? Because Jesus was dead and now is alive for himself and for you. Amen.